Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I'm your host, Daniel Dolphin. This morning, our guest is Mr. Bruce Sandifer. Bruce first fell in love with the lure of bridle horses in his early teenage years, and he started working for some of the big outfits right out of school. He learned from everyone he could, including Ed Connell's books, and those were a big influence to him. He has spent time as a horse trainer and soon became disenchanted with today's show pen world, something he and I definitely have in common. He decided to stick to the traditional Californio style and began teaching people some years ago. He now gives lessons and workshops from his home base in Santa Barbara, California. He has founded the Californio Bridle Horse Association, whose mission reads as following: to preserve and protect an essential and threatened part of both California and Western U.S. history, the method of horsemanship and stockmanship developed by the early Californios and the International Association for the Preservation of Early California Bridle Horses and Stockmanship. I'm sorry I stumbled through that. I have a little trouble reading my own handwriting sometimes. So, Mr. Sandifer, how are you this morning?
I'm well, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Well, I try to get the scope of the whole horse world out there, and I think you're definitely a good representation of the California style and traditions and so forth. So I'm excited to have this chat with you. Colt, we're in my office. I've got a sick son and several animals. Colt, cat, remove it now. This is where it's good we can edit. Every single time I do this, I wind up with a cat in here I didn't know about, and they wind up making a fuss. I don't know.
Yeah, it never fails. As soon as you get on something like this, everybody in the world comes walking in.
Okay, my apologies. So we start off every podcast with the lightning round questions just to loosen everybody up. So, Mr. Sandifer, what is your favorite way to relax?
My favorite way to relax? Well, I like naps.
Okay. That's a good one.
Yeah, I know. I find we try to stay pretty relaxed around here. We don't get too uptight about things. So just living life every day is pretty relaxing, I think.
I've seen enough pictures on your Facebook page that rides on the beach have got to be a pretty good way to end the day. You seem to live in a very beautiful setting there.
Yeah, we're blessed.
Are you a morning or an evening person?
Well, I'm good in the morning. I like to get up early, but I'm not very good in the middle of the day, but at night's when I do my best thinking.
What's your favorite color of horse? Bay, sorrel, or something else?
Now I got to say bay. A bay horse. I don't know. I've had some very good bay horses, and they seem to be pretty even.
This is one of those very controversial questions, but do you think that pineapple belongs on pizza?
No, I don't believe so.
All right. Do you have a...
I'm not opposed to it, but, it's not a preference.
I don't really have a big deal with that. There are some people that have some very strong feelings about that question. I don't get it, but hey. Do you have any particular pet peeve?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I see is people taking the sensitivity out of horses, over desensitization and the practice of it. For me, that's a huge pet peeve. I think sensitivity should be cultivated, not erased.
I certainly agree with that, especially if you work cows. Sometimes you're looking this way and your four-legged partner needs to get you the hell out of the way without having to be told, right? Do you have a favorite beverage?
A favorite beverage? Well, I'm a big fan of coffee.
Okay. Do you drink coffee after the mid-afternoon nap? You like the perk in the middle of the day or just the morning time or what?
No, I'm a pretty much frequent coffee drinker. I'll drink it whenever it's offered or available.
Can you tell us something unexpected about you? So you're this Californio bridle horse guy. Do you fly hang gliders on the weekend, or is there something we wouldn't see coming about you?
No, let's see, unexpected. I guess the thing that's probably unexpected to a lot of people is that I enjoy the aspects of a lot of different styles of horsemanship, and I study a very broad variety. I don't think getting tunnel vision in your horsemanship allows for growth, and so I'm a big fan of classical dressage and some of the things implemented. I don't think a lot of it really pertains to the stock horse, but I believe that some of the methods are strongly related.
Yes, sir. We'll talk about it later, but I really feel like there's sort of a common ancestor at a fork in the road somewhere back there between the bridle horse and dressage. Get your thoughts on that later, but there's a lot of similarities, I think. If you could have any superpower, what superpower would you choose?
I think it would be, I would like to be a better communicator.
Thoughts or feelings? You more an analytical thinker or an intuitive, seat of the pants, go with your gut sort of a guy?
I'm kind of a ride by feel. I think feel is always my first clues, if you will. First feel I get is the most important, and then I'll try to analyze the feel from there. So feel first.
Okay. Do you have a favorite piece of tack or horse-related tool?
For me, it's the hackamore. I think that the hackamore is highly underrated and highly misunderstood, but I believe it's a great tool to develop horses into balanced and confident horses.
Do you have a favorite book or movie?
Well, my favorite book, I would say, not really. I'm pretty well read, but I don't really have anything favorite. Yeah, of course, Lonesome Dove. I like that. That was a good movie. So,
it doesn't bother you watching Captain Call ride with rein chains and split reins throughout the movie? That doesn't tickle you somewhere?
Well, you can't. If you picked apart everything you saw in horsemanship in movies, you wouldn't like anything with horses. That's for sure.
Yes. Do you have a guilty pleasure that you wouldn't mind sharing with us?
Yeah. Let's see, a guilty pleasure. I don't know. I don't. I'm trying to think of what that would be. No, I'm a big. I like to eat a lot. Eating is one of my favorite things, but
okay,
I don't know if that's a guilty pleasure.
That's fair enough. What type of cuisine do y'all have over in California? I have not made it that way. Is it more Mexican, Spanish influence stuff, or anything under?
Yeah, a lot of Mexican influence things. We have a really good barbecue, so I'm a big fan of oak barbecue that they do here. They do a Santa Maria style tri-tip and stuff that we're pretty famous for around this particular area.
Okay.
And so we always like that. Good barbecue.
Hard to beat.
Can't beat that.
What's your favorite dinosaur?
My favorite dinosaur. Oh,
Once you get to be about 8 or 9, no one ever asks you that anymore, so I thought I had to include
yeah, no, that's that is an interesting question. I should know this. My partner has some young kids. They're always telling me about the dinosaurs, and I can't remember the names. You only remember like T-Rexes, so
yes,
I'll go with that.
All right. And have you ever had a UFO encounter?
Well, I won't say I've had a UFO. I've seen some strange things,
Yes, sir.
you know, in
So,
the night sky, but
so
I don't know if I've ever had a UFO encounter.
I think you are my 10th or 11th guess, and it's about 50-50 of people that have said they've seen something weird out there that they're not real sure of, and people that have just said no, which surprises me. I didn't really think anybody would own up to that. So, all right. Well, that's the end of the short answer questions. I'm going to give you 172 points. So that's a high score so far. Congratulations.
No, thanks.
All right. Well, now we've loosened up a little and broken the ice. Why don't we get into the horses? So I'm going to ask you a couple of abstract questions that you're going to hate me for, but just get your take on it. So you mentioned riding a horse by feel a little bit ago. What does feel mean to you?
The lack of resistance. I think feel to me is the lack of resistance, biomechanical resistance, emotional resistance. To me, when things are right, it's almost like floating. It's a very there's very little contacts, if you will, running into each other.
Yes, sir. Well, let me ask you this then, just to be contradictory. Would you say that there can be horses that are lacking resistance in the wrong places? So for instance, I'm not sure about this. I'll always pick on reining in the Western world when I use bad examples, but I've ridden a bunch of reining horses whose flexion at the pole was like they were on a hinge, and they would over flex in the blink of an eye, but there'd be zero resistance, even though they were going somewhere I didn't want them to go. So how would you characterize that part of feel?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. We have to realize what's an evasion from contact, which it can also be a feel of, non-resistance. I think a lot of people think that when a horse is evading engagement, a lot of times that it's light, and really it's just escaping using itself in a lot of ways. So I think that's one of the big things that we have to develop as we learn is that when the horse gets away from something, is it evading it or is it engaging with it? Is there an engagement response or is it a disengagement and basically an escape?
Yes, sir. We'll go with another abstract topic. And again, we have listeners that are all over the world, and I'm sure a lot of them aren't really familiar with the tradition. So would you just kind of give us a 101 version of what the progression of a bridle horse is, the jaquima to freno progression there?
Well, I think, that in modern times that's become quite different, or I'll give you my version, which is we don't start our horses until they're 4. We give them a little more time to develop and get their bones set a little more. And we start them in the hackamore. And so we work them, we get them used to things on the ground for a little while, and we just use a hackamore. We'll use a hackamore about a year and a half, depending on ourselves and the horse, until it develops enough collection and gathered and is good with the rider and knows about everything we need it to know. And then we proceed to the 2-rein, which is the hackamore with the addition of the bridle. The bridle is about balance. So the whole process of the hackamore is creating balance in the horse's body and tuning it to our balance. Then we progress to the bridle, and we do this because it helps maintain it. It's a steadier bridle signal. We 2-rein it for as long as we feel that we need to, and then eventually we ride them straight up. When I say bridle, I mean spade bit. That's what we ride. That's all I ride is spade bits. Personally, I only ride Santa Barbara spade bits because I feel that they have the best solid neutral position and balance.
I'll ask a few questions on the tack right there and some of the, well, again, I'm trying to be candid. Some arguments I've gotten into with some flat hatters over the years. And I do find that the group in particular has some pretty strong disagreements on some of the terms. So, for instance, I about got in a fist fight with a guy that was determined to tell me that a hackamore had to have a Fyodor knot on it or it wasn't a hackamore. If it's just a bozal and a hanger and a Makati, then he'd call it a bozal, but hackamore wasn't the correct term and so forth. So would you give us your definitions on what the traditional terms actually mean and where the caveats are? And I guess I'll ask you this separately since this is a big question, but I'm going to ask you to define a spade bit too. What the specific mechanics that have to be there in order to make it a spade bit are. So I guess let's start with the hackamore. So,
well, with the hackamore, I am a Fyodor using guy. I haven't always been. It's something that I came across later in my studies. I mean, I started like everybody else. I used to be snaffle bit, hackamore, 2-rein. We would use a half breed and then go up into a spade, kind of more modern style. What I found was there were certain aspects of that did not complement each other, that were not in a straight line progression that I wanted to be in. So I took away a lot of things, the snaffle being one of them, and then also progression bits up into a spade bit. But about the hackamore, for me, I start my horses in a relatively soft hackamore, one that's fairly flexible, at least 5/8 in diameter, something that's not going to bite them too much. I don't want a lot of authority when I first start my horses. I don't want to intimidate them into places. I want to have them feel comfortable enough to tension is really the anti-engagement. A horse doesn't want to engage into things that it's afraid of. And so the reason that the Fyodor is important to me is because it creates a neutral balance position. When we adjust our Fyodor right, instead of us having to lift our hands, the horse can float inside the circle that is the hackamore. And so it creates a place where you can teach the horse to look for, where you don't have to hold it up with your hands to keep them in a certain framework, which is, correctly adjusted. It's going to be right ahead of vertical, slightly ahead of vertical in its head position. So when we pick up on our reins, the horse would come to vertical no further as we lift our hand. But it's really not the hand lift, it's the drive from behind. And that's where I differ, I think, and some people, their idea on this style is that it starts from the piece in your hand. And I believe it starts from the hind end of the horse and goes to your hands. And so I like a soft, a hackamore without a lot of authority, because I want to push him to a place where he's not scared of. Push the horse up into the bridle, up into the hackamore, so that everything initiates from the hind end. So our seat is way more important than our hands in that respect, as far as I'm concerned, if you're riding a horse from back to front.
We had the Louisiana Equine Council meeting yesterday, and we had a guest clinician, Mr. David Carter, and he rode some problem horses. And I was standing next to a lady, and he was riding a horse that was having some real problems tracking on a straight line. He was going through the arena, horse was kind of veering off and heading the underway and all. So a pretty green horse. And the lady kept commenting how little he was holding on to the horse's face. And that's one of those things that I don't think the general public understands. The horse you hold the least is the greenest horse, and you kind of just pick up soft and get in, get out. But if you're riding a young horse and you have contact on the reins 90% of the time, that is not going to go well in the end. You have to be building that relationship and very much with the get in, get out, or you're going to wind up with an uncontrollable basket case that's numb to the whole deal in the end. So
yeah, I think that's true. You're going to have to be able to ride the horse forward and allow it to go places, and then guide it between lines. I mean, basically, that's what we're trying to do. I think that keeping the horse in between both sides of our body, the reins, the piece of equipment you're riding, whatever it is, and being able to go someplace, that's got to always be the first step.
So let's say that someone out there was interested in going and buying a hackamore. What would be some of the options that they might have? Like you were talking about one that doesn't bite them. Does that have more to do with diameter or number of plats, or what would you be looking for specifically there? Because there really are a lot of variations in hackamores I don't think most people are aware of. So,
yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times people end up, we want to stay with the rawhide core. We want to have one that's real flexible and that will actually shape around a horse's head or face, but not so raggy that it doesn't have create a good circle, where the horse can be in when nothing's hitting. Basically, it's like playing operation. You teach the horse to stay inside of that circle without hitting the edges. It's like operation. You don't want them to light up the nose. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have enough body in that. One of the big things I see is a lot of them have too long of a nose butt, and so it doesn't release quickly enough. The further down the hanger on the sides of the hackamore, the slower the heel knock will release. And you'll see it for a while there in the 60s and such. They got to where they had a 12-inch nose, but because people were just showing in Western pleasure, and they didn't like where the hanger would come into the contact with the eye. Instead of tying it out, they just lengthened the nose, but we would rather set it up to where, you either tie that out of the eye, which won't change the balance of the hackamore. So I watch for that. I don't like over, say, 8.5 inches over the top for a nose button. As far as the amount of plates, as long as it's braided smoothly, it doesn't really matter. You just don't want anything that feels like you're chewing rasp. Something smoothly made.
Yes, sir.
I tend to prefer a rawhide nose button and a Latigo or kangaroo body. And the nose button, I like it rawhide because it just helps maintain the shape a little bit. Gives the horse, they can feel it rotate because we're really not about pulling on them very little. In a hackamore, where that's a little bit different than a snaffle bit. A snaffle bit is kind of more effective with low hands. They tend to, that gives you a good engagement with the lower jaw of the horse. When you lift it up, it tends to lift off the jaw and into the mouth a little further. A hackamore is not like that. It's a lifting apparatus. It's designed by ropers. The whole California style is a roping style. Well, to get to your horn, you have to lift your hand. And so if you have low hands, it's really hard to dally. And it's not good to dally above your reins. So it's a lifting style, and instead of a pulling back. And we rarely try not to pull back behind the fork. Lifting in front of it, that's a different story. But it's designed to lift, so you want it to lift and release. The movement has more to do with the contact. As we know, it doesn't have enough force to really back the horse off. It can be created, you can intimidate them for a very small time, but you're going to run out of bullets pretty quickly, and you can't hang on. I feel like a lot of people try the hackamore, but they don't have very good success, so they end up going back to the snaffle bit because it takes a lot more thought and care to be successful for any length of time in hackamore.
We have that issue in bits too. That's one of the reasons for that video that I felt it's warranted, because a lot of people do what I call fail their way through the bits rather than graduate their way. And they
progression of failure. Exactly.
They run out of bullets and then they need a bigger gun. And that's not the way it's supposed to be done. But I guess a couple other things with the Hackamore. You talked about the nose button and the material. What about adjustment on the horse's face? So you can go a little higher up the cheek or a little lower toward the mouth. Is that dependent on the horse for you, or do you? I know like Benny Guitron is pretty famous for liking it up pretty high. I think Al Dunning is that way. I've always preferred it a little lower myself. So where do you fall in that?
Now, I fall in from the point where I don't go below the notch in the nose. And then if you run down the side of the top of your horse's nose, you'll hit a notch there. And that's where solid bone quits. And it becomes in your video, it shows, the skull and there's two little fine bones that come down there and split off. And so I like to stay at that notch or above, just because I don't want to be on soft tissue. I want it to rest on bone. You're less likely to run in there. And I don't ever want the horse to feel like it's getting, in any way, its air cut off. And the adjustment, I want it to come into contact. If you pick up on your heel knot, slightly past the point where it passes the center line, if you will, on your nose button, in within a half inch to 3/4 of an inch, I want it to start to hit the chin at that point, but have a good range. A couple of inches of range in there. So I usually, if I can stick two fingers in below, in their jaw, Makati in their chin, their jaw, that's usually a pretty good start. I may be a little looser on colts for the first couple of times. I feel they have to move their mouths and not feel restricted or trapped. They get a little claustrophobic if you have too tight.
So you do need to take the conformation of the horse into account, and there are different sizes of bozals and so forth for a coarser made horse versus a finer made, like a little Arab or something like that. You could have him swimming in a bozal.
Yeah, that's true. You probably don't want 5 or 6 wraps below your rein. Another thing I see is people putting, several wraps above their reins, and they think they're going to get some leverage on there. And if you're trying to get leverage, if you're trying to create force with your Hackamore, you should probably just not use a Hackamore. It's not something. And a lot of people, of course, get confused with, Hackamore bits or mechanical Hackamores, and they think that's something that's, but those are they're just vicing the whole head vices. And so that's a whole different kind of Hackamore riding.
Yeah, I try not to be real judgmental. I kind of figure if, you're an adult and you can make your own decisions and buy whatever you want and put it on your horse, but you definitely do notice there are certain bits and mechanics and so forth that you just never see a happy horse in, and a mechanical Hackamore is one of those. That is rarely a pretty picture to watch. It's normally pretty cringeworthy. What about, I guess, other things we could talk about?
All bits I was going to say all pieces of equipment have a place where they can be abused or where they stop being a signal and start being a forceful thing. I tend to go err on the side of less force. To me, I think if I have any kind of a relationship with my horse, he's going to get scared. I'm going to grab hold of him sometimes. And there's going to be moments where I take a hold of him. What I want to do is have something on his face where I can support him, but not scared. If you're scared, pain doesn't usually help fear, as far as I've ever, And so adding pain to a fearful response generally is not a very good solution in the long run.
I always think about it in that pain tends to always work as a demotivator. So if you think of like a hot wire fence, you don't pee on a hot wire fence 3 times in a row. You should have stopped doing something, but it's not a real good motivator to get you to do something. It definitely can be overused with a horse for sure. So another thing or two about a hackamore is there's some changes in diameter that would typically take place. So you said you would start with at least a 5/8. So about the biggest we would ever find would be a 3/4 or so, and a 5/8 is probably the most common. But where would we go from there, and what sort of milestones are you looking for in your horse that tell you that it might be time to change or adjust something and kind of progress down the road?
Well, we start with the heavier one, or the bigger diameter. As we know, the bigger diameter it is, the less bite. Doesn't matter what you have, the bits, whatever it is, the larger diameter, the larger surface area has less bite. And so we start with that because we don't want to scare the horse in the beginning. We want to understand what we're doing. Then we may graduate. So, you may start with a 3/4, and it really depends. It's more about weight. And the way that I do it is more about weight. I want that weight. So when the horse is out of position, out of balance with the hackamore setup, that it feels the weight. It's not enough to make it change, but it understands when it's out of balance. When a horse is correctly in balance, the whole weight of the hackamore rig is run on the hanger. Okay? When his head's in the right position, the nose button is not sitting on his nose, bumping up and down. It's just sliding off like a rock down a hill, basically. And the heel knot is picked up a little bit, so he can get there and stay in that slightly ahead of vertical position. That's the weight. That's why I start with a bigger one. As the horse understands this, as we've developed the core so he can maintain that a little bit on his own through collection, and he learns to carry himself a little more that way, then I can use less. I can use less to give him the same, to understand the same thing. So less weight. Weight is big, important, really important in the California system. The weight of the equipment amplifies the balance. Okay. As the horse progresses, it takes less amplification for the horse to find a balance point. And so we move down. You might go to a 1/2 inch. I have 3 hackamores that I use. You'll see these guys and they have different weights range. I have different range. If you get one that's a little bit dull, you can use a different rein, maybe a tighter rein, to get in there, draw a little bit and say, hey, don't push on me. Mm-hmm. But if that doesn't come through the body, it's not going to matter anyway. I use a 5/8, rarely a 1/2 inch, then a 3/8, and then I'll go to a 5/16 as my tuner. And so once the horse understands the balance, it doesn't take as much equipment. I think a lot of people are thinking that certain kinds of equipment are going to improve their horsemanship. And I think that equipment can either emphasize the horsemanship that you're trying to do or distract from it. And I try to use the California system the way that I do it. And I feel that this equipment works best with what I'm trying to create with my seat, with my balance in my seat. The way I use my seat is exactly like the bit balance. And so it's exactly like the hackamore balance. When I disrupt balance, that's a signal. I disrupt the balance that we're in what we call a neutral position. We disrupt the balance, and that sets the horse up for the movement. The release allows the movement, which is engagement. Disrupting balance is attention. Relaxing in between the stride. That's why it's only a pick. It's just a stride at a time. So if you pick a stride and you release, and that allows it to happen. And so the signal is disruption of balance. The reward is return to balance.
This is one of the things, like, I definitely don't consider myself a Californio or a traditionalist, but to me, good horsemanship is good horsemanship. And I would think that a dressage rider or a good reining trainer or whatever that just listened to what you said about neutral and signal and all, there should be no one that disagrees with that. I mean, that's no matter how you're riding a horse, that should be a major underlying principle of the way you're going about it. If you're not doing it that way, you're just wrestling a damn horse, and that's not what I want to do all day. So
it becomes, I don't want to fight. I like horses. I've done it other ways, and I mean, it took me a lot of years. Cowboying, you're just basically trying to survive a lot of the horses and the country and things like that, and then you get into what these people that do amazing things, and you go, wow, boy, when you look behind the curtain and you go, wow, is that what it takes to get that? And then pretty soon you go home and you feel bad, you feel like you're losing your soul, and pretty soon you don't like horses anymore. They become a commodity. And so to me, I find that I think the best horsemen are always trying to do what's best for the horse.
Yes, sir. It should be a big
no matter what kind of hat they wear.
There you go. That should be a big part of the definition of a horseman. I mean, if you don't have the horse's well-being and their mental and emotional state in mind, then what are you doing? I guess the last part of the Hackamore that you've kind of alluded to a bunch that we haven't discussed specifically is the heel knot. So there are a few different styles. The weight and the balance can be changed there. A plug can be added or not added. So what are your thoughts on those deals? What's your setup preference?
Well, the heel knot has one purpose, and that is to, once the rein is lifted, it's moved up and rotates the nose button, that it should drop back. The reason we use a Feodor is so that when it drops back, it doesn't drop back to the point where it hits the chin, because that would be counterproductive. Okay. A lot of people just think of Feodors for one reason, so the horse doesn't pull back and, get the bottom over their chin. I mean, we've all done if you've used a Hackamore very much, but that one, that part where they have the bottom of the Hackamore in the mouth is not a good place. So that's what it's for. So I think that, a lot of it's just practical. It's got to have enough weight to drop the reins back. And of course, the weight you have on your reins, if you have one that has a light heel knot, you put a little weight. A lot of times you run a big old bolt or something down your Macati and it'll drop it back down, because that's the purpose of it. I get a lot of grief because I run the tassel on my Macatis to the back. Mm-hmm. And people are, you tied your Macati wrong. And I'm like, well, no. When I release that, I don't want it to come down there and tickle the horse's chin. If anything that I can do to give the horse an excuse to be bothered, then I'm going to do that. And I think that may break with tradition, but I think tradition evolves.
It's just good sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wholeheartedly with you. I ride snaffles more than anything, but like I put the slobber strap on my snaffles behind the rein for the same reason. There was a particular horse years ago that she was always a fidgety little mare, just moving her head around and could never get comfortable. And one day I was working in the round pen and I just had a bridle on her, just tied the reins up on the saddle horn and moving her around. And she stopped and was breathing. And I always liked her. She was a good-minded little mare, but when you put a bridle on, she just got fidgety. And I noticed the tassels on my string was tickling her whiskers, and that was the whole damn problem. I got it out of the way and boom, different horse. I mean, night and day immediately. I think horses are ticklish as all get out, and if you're tickling them, they're not going to be happy about it. So I'm wholeheartedly with you right there. I'm really glad that you said that. I've had that same thought about the Feodor. My introduction to using a Feodor versus not was self-defense, because I was riding around a bunch of guys that would love to ride up beside you, and if they caught you on a colt with a Hackamore, they were going to grab him and slip it off, and here's your first bridleless ride in a 800-acre pasture, and so you put that on there, and now they can't. You at least have 3 seconds to defend yourself before they can slip it off, but it does change things, like you say. Now the heel knot's not going all the way up to the chin and so forth, and I'm really glad we had that discussion. This is why I picked you, because I feel like you're a critically thinking guy, and just like you said, traditions can evolve, and any of those guys that were on the ranches 300 years ago, if they had come across a problem and found a solution that was a better way, they would have used it. And I think we have the same obligation today.
Well, and that's the thing too. I'm amazed at these were not really sophisticated guys in a lot of manner. Most of them couldn't even write their names, but the science in this system is quite amazing. The balance and how it's put together. There's very little in the world that really compares to as well thought out as it through the whole system. To me, that's intriguing. I think that rediscovering it has been, could be a life's work. I mean, they had the advantage of their grandfathers would teach them. And so they were that far ahead. They always brought it along, though. If you look at the transitions, it was brought from early vaqueros, from Mission era, through the process. By the end, and Angloization and the influx of other people coming into the country, it was an amazingly technical and balanced system as far as each piece that they put involved, every piece from the way the reins were built, from the weights and the balances, specifically designed for each horse.
I guess we talked a lot about the hackamore. To me, a big part of that system is the Makati. So what are some of or I guess first, why don't you tell everybody what a Makati is and some of the finer points of that and how you might go about changing that with the hackamore. So you mentioned that a minute ago, but not in great deal. So like we have diameters of the Bozal, we would have diameters of the Makati as well.
Sure. I think a lot of people on Makatis, they're very, I think you got to like the feel of it in your hand. It's got to have some weight and balance, a good drape, something that's not too light. But most importantly, I like the old 4-strand Makatis a lot. I use some 6 strands with cores, the heart. So heart Makati with core has it's what they call a heart, and that's just a twisted piece of rope inside of it. But generally, I prefer main hair Makati, stuff that's fairly decent on your hand. We used to twist them out of cowtails when we talk cows, so then they tend to get a little bit stiffer when it gets wet, as do tail hair ones. But, there's a feel to a Makati you get used to. You can take a tail hair Makati on a horse that maybe has gotten dulled up, or you get in your string and just needs to be backed off a little bit, put on a tail hair Makati. And as that horse sweats and it gets stamped, it's going to get a little stiffer, and that gives you a little bit more emphasis on the jaw. It's a trick. And to me, a trick is used when we fail. But a lot of times we're not dealing with things that we create. We're having to deal with things that other people have created. And so to get that horse backed off enough that you can have a dialogue, sometimes that's necessary. I feel that we're not starting with a blank page. So sometimes we have to be willing to color a little bit outside of maybe what we want to do to get to where we can start. But Makatis, you'll hear it different. There's different weights and things like that, diameters. Like I'll use a 1/2-inch Makati on a 5/8 a lot of times if I'm going to rub.
Yes, sir.
Because it's easier in your hand, and it's not, some people, oh no, it's got to be the same diameter as the Bozal, right? But I think a lot of these, a lot of rules are by people that really don't understand the system.
Mr. Sandifer, I've just had another cat problem. So would you mind backing up to where you said that it's typically the same diameter and take it from there?
Yeah, I think generally the Makati is the same. A 5/8 Makati goes on a 5/8 Bozal, but I think there's some room there as the horse develops along, and it doesn't need the weight of that. Instead of going down to a 1/2 inch Bosal, you can go to a lighter Makati. The horse understands where it needs to be better. I do this when I have to rope. I don't really like roping on my hackamore horses a lot, but sometimes the job requires that. If you look at old pictures, which is really interesting, say from the 30s and stuff, I've had some very good mentors, and they show crews, and the guys in hackamores and the guys in two-rein horses, not even carrying their riatas. Only the guys on bridle horses were carrying their riatas. They developed horses to a very high degree before they started putting them in positions where the horse is really going to have to work. These days, we don't have that luxury. Sometimes we have to just go ahead and do it. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm pretty careful about it. But if you have to do that, a half-inch Makati is a lot easier on your hand if you're backing a long rope, which we tend to back a little bit longer ropes than, say, a lot of folks in your country.
Well, I'm one of the exceptions there. I've always been a long rope sort of a guy. When you probably don't know much about me, but I came up as a cutting horse futurity guy, 2-year-old man, and all cutting horse operations are actually yearling backgrounding operations, and that's how they're getting the cattle to work. And so that was one of my responsibilities, was doctoring the yearlings. And I always took it as a personal offense. If I ever had to chase a calf out across a pasture to rope him or something, I was not going to be happy that day. I always thought it was my responsibility to be a little slicker and a little softer about it. We were usually doing that off of the 2-year-olds. Anyway, I like what you just said actually surprises me, because to me, some of the lessons that a horse can learn while roping are that's part of the giving it a job and developing it along. They seem to really figure out some things when you're dragging and, all of that part of it. But that's, that's interesting. Sometimes history isn't what we expected it to be. So, well, I think, I'm not saying that a person, shouldn't rope and get your rope down on to do some stuff. I just think it should be in a place where you're not putting the horse at a disadvantage right away, because they can learn a lot of bad things roping, getting in jackpots and stuff like that don't go away for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we have the ability to introduce them to them in bite-sized portions, that's a lot different than going out and saying roping 50 or 60 calves into running or something like that, and where the horse gets tired and sore. In that process, they're going to get dull, and they're going to not be able to carry themselves in collection or to use themselves as well for that kind of time period. And so it adds a lot of things where they get to pushing, or we have to use a little bit more, get a little more handsy with them just to get through the day. But I think I'm not opposed to roping on them. I just want to keep it into chunks where, a lot of the old timers here, when they said the old time vaqueros, the real guys that had come up through the rancho period after the mission period, they said when they got done, they'd been in ranches that were taken over by Anglos, which was more about production. But when their horses got done, even their bridle horses, they just stopped. That was it. And they were like, no, my horse, he's done what he can do today. Yes.
And so that mañana attitude was, don't do anything today that's not going to make your horse better in the future, or that's going to inhibit your progression. And I think a lot of people think that was lazy, but it's more about, look, if I do this today, yes, I may get this done today, but tomorrow I'm going to have to fix it. And I may have to fix this for 2 weeks, which is not going to bring my progression along.
Yes. Or injure the animal. They get fatigued and now they slip or something. And it's way more than 2 weeks. So,
right.
Well, is there more? So mañana was something I was going to ask you about a little later on, but do you want to talk a little more about that? Or are you satisfied with that? Or?
Well, I think that mañana attitude is fairly important. It's not putting things off. It's just trying not to do things that you're going to have to fix or going through a process. It's like a lot of people, they've got to be doing things with these horses all the time. So they'll tend to lunge a horse till it drops his shoulder, its hips are kicked out or something, just because they think that they've got to be doing something with these horses. And it's like, well, you can do things, but I think we have to really think and see that. And if until you've made a few bridle horses, it's very difficult to know what's going to cause you problems later on. Until you've finished horses, we're a society of starters, horse starters. Nobody really finishes. It's like, well, we just recycle. We're in this evergreen type of society. It's like, what can we do in 30 days, 3 days, whatever? But to just not do anything that you're going to have to fix later, I think that's the manana attitude. And my idea of manana is just try to be aware. What do I do today that I'm going to have to fix, or maybe set me back later on?
Yes, sir. To my mind, it's kind of like maturity. It's sort of the difference between the 50-year-old ranch hand that's thinking ahead and planning and setting things up and has an order that makes sense, and the 21-year-old that you're always going, why did you do that? That was supposed, just they're more in the way than they're helpful,
They can't help themselves.
Yes, I like the enthusiasm, but couldn't you have thought about that for about 3 minutes before you? Well, that was a lot of time on the Hackmore, and I'm glad we spent it. That was more than I was planning on talking, but I wholeheartedly agree with you that it's incredibly misunderstood and undervalued in a lot of different systems, and there's a good place for it. I had a cutting colt that was a little stallion, and he was kind of out of some of the ranker bloodlines and was pretty tough, and I wound up riding him most of his 2-year-old year in a Hackamore, and that wound up being just the trick for him. So like what you're talking about, I'm glad to hear you being unconventional in a few senses. To me, that's where mastery comes in. When you really understand all of the individual components and how they work, kind of, the rules. Now you also can recognize where you can break some rules to make things better and change things up a little bit here and there. And that's kind of where you progress from science to art, I guess. Like a race car driver, he knows he can take this engine and this transmission and change that rear end that's not supposed to go with it, but he can make it work. Now he's going to go even faster because he really understands the breakdowns of how the parts play together.
Sure.
Well, I think we have hit the spot where I need to do the sponsor for this episode. So our sponsor for this episode is the Unicorn Bit. Does your horse sometimes go too fast or not stop as quickly or as hard as you'd like? Does he often toss or shake his head or show other signs of displeasure? You need Dr. Silvertongue's Miraculous Unicorn Bit. Our Miraculous Unicorn Bit is made with a proprietary blend of metals, including meteorites from outer space. They are forged in the fires of Mount Doom and quenched in the saliva of Incan princesses. After passing inspection by our experts, every Dr. Silvertongue's Miraculous Unicorn Bit is then blessed by Druid priests. This bit will put the perfect headset on any horse with no skill or adjustments required on your part. They'll stop, turn, and still want cuddles when the ride has ended. Our Miraculous Unicorn Bit will also make the perfect pot of coffee, remove old wallpaper, and cures polio. If you are having horse problems, you don't need experience or expensive trainers. You need Dr. Silvertongue's Miraculous Unicorn Bit. We have special payment plans with approved credit. So thank you to that sponsor for this episode. All right. So we talked about the Hackamore. Let's get into spades, and I'm going to ask you first off, what specifically makes a spade a spade? What characteristics in your mind have to be present, or it's not a spade, it's something else?
All right. To me, a spade bit has to have braces. That's a very integral part of the whole thing. I'm not a big fan of shorter spades. I like a minimum of 4 inches tall from cannon bar to the top of the spoon. I want the most coverage. One of the big things about, we say they're a signal bit. And what they are is they're a slow bit, a very slow bit. Okay. A spade is a super, super slow bit. I noticed in your video, you talked about slow hands being slow, giving the signals time to work. Most bits, as you know, right now in this day and age, they're built to engage the curb strap and therefore the pressure on the lower jaw and bars quickly. A spade is not designed for that. So braces, height, counterbalance, a strong neutral position. To me, is that when you lay that bit in your hand and you move your hand back and forth, that bit does not move a lot. It's not like a pendulum where it just rocks back and forth. It stays in a position. Depending on your horse, its conformation. I like mine at, let's say, 5 degrees ahead of vertical. And so that the comfort place for that bit to sit in the horse's mouth is ahead of vertical. And that's where it balances. That's where it hangs from the headstall. In the horse's mouth, it floats, so to speak. The braces shouldn't be too close to the bar. They need a little bit of distance from the cannon bar, but not so much the horse is going to run its tongue through there. What you'll see in most traditional old-time spades. I have a guy that he's also a collector, the guy that builds my bits, and he builds them on Merdueño patterns. Merdueño is the one that came up with the Santa Barbara style spade, him and Jose Ortega, Francisco Ortega, who was the commandant of the Presidio in Santa Barbara. They became used around Santa Barbara a lot, so hence the name, Santa Barbara bits. The reason I like this is the counterbalance makes that solid, real steady neutral position. When you move it out of neutral, it returns to neutral very quickly on its own.
Would you mind just stating real quick what specific aspect of, so the Santa Barbara is a cheek style. What specific aspect of the Santa Barbara makes that cheek a Santa Barbara?
Well, it'll come down like any other bit, and then it has a bell or a crown, circle out the back. And so if you look at it, the progression in California was what they came from with Spain. What they still use in Spain is the Las Cruces, a straight cheeked bit that's very much like a pendulum. Las Cruces, and you see a lot of people are using them now. They used to have a lip chain or chain that would go behind the bit to keep it from rocking forward, when the horse went. That's kind of gone the way, they don't use them anymore. But that's what it's for, because the bit would swing forward and cause the horses to flip their heads.
Yes.
Or they would get hold of the cheek. Then became an S cheek. That was pretty popular afterwards. And then towards the end of the California era, the Santa Barbara was developed. And that bell is the counterbalance. That's what rocks it back. And you'll see them with spots or teardrops later on, silver spots or teardrops. Well, that was just, they would change the balance for certain horses. And so one of the big things is local stories around here, a few miles down the road here, is where Merdueño's shop was. And he would set up his bit shop along the beach. He lived a little further up the canyon. Between here and Ventura, between Santa Barbara and Ventura. When the vaqueros brought their hackamore horses, they would ride between the missions to go work. They would stop at the beach there. It was a place where the tide would come up and they couldn't pass until low tide. He would watch them ride the horses. They went down, worked, and when they came back, he'd have a bit built for that horse when it was ready to progress with the correct balances. That's why you'll see a lot of little variances in different spade bits. We don't have that luxury, so we try to get a bit that fits, kind of like a semi-quarter tree or something. It's going to fit the most horses that we ride. I do, on my horses, I do have specifically built because, that's what I do. So, but I don't have I'm not riding 50 horses. I also have the variances or degrees, very fine degrees. I do ride about 400 or 500 horses in my workshops throughout the years. Each year, we bridle between 60 and 70 horses first time in spade bit. So that's the important things for me in a spade bit is mostly it's that balance, where the balance point is, and that it kind of matches pretty similar to where the horse is carrying himself. Not as an unbroke horse. If you watch a horse at 2 weeks and running around a colt, I love to see a colt at 2 weeks because you watch they're perfectly balanced. They can switch leads, no problem. They're always ready to do the next thing, and they kind of carry themselves with that. So you can look at that and say, okay, find out the degree of that, and that horse, you can build a bit for that horse right then. It's after they developed in the hackamore, because posture changes through exercise, through development, through strength training. Horses change, their conformation changes. Muscle, develops the body. And so where that horse is at the point where you feel he's ready for the bridle, that's the balances that you want to have built into your bit or look for in a bit that's built. So that's what I look for in a spade bit. And certain horses' weight can be an issue. You'll find that mares are a lot more that they need a little bit lighter bit. Horses that are more finished, you can go to a lighter bit. I think it's almost like if you walk around in leg weights, ankle weights all day, I like to start them in a little bit heavier bit because it's slower. The balances are slower when that bit moves because of the weight. It keeps things slowed down, but it also has more signal to the horse. And then as the horse develops, its posture changes, I'll go to a lighter bit, just like the hackamore progression. And so a lot of times in my really finished bridle horses, they'll have a fairly light bit. It's just how a horse reacts to. It takes a while for horses to learn to pack these bits, to learn to carry them, right?
Yes, sir.
They have a lot of surface area in the mouth, so there's a lot of metal there. But they need to learn how to hold it because it's more weight than a lot of bits, sometimes up to 2 pounds. A bit weighs up to 2 pounds. A lot of people freak out, and they're like, well, they're so good in the hackamore, why do you put a bit on? Well, the bit just refines it. It allows us to use less to develop more. Less movement, less signal. When you get with a hackamore, there's quite a bit. It's a real flexible system. Well, this is a more rigid system. It's just the horses learn to color on the lines. We fine up the lines. And we to work in a little more detail. So that is the process of the two-ring. The horse knows how to carry itself. We still keep a hackamore or bosalita underneath, and we start putting the bridle on. A lot of people put the bridle on and hang it and do all kinds of things. I'm not a big fan of that. It's the first bit our horses have. I think that should be, noted, is that we haven't put other bits. It hasn't had a snaffle. It hasn't had any other bit in its mouth until the spade. And just like a snaffle bit, when you first put it on, they're going to fidget around like you saw in one of your videos you showed. That horse is going to mouth around and figure it out. I find that they don't do any more like that with a spade bit than they did to do a snaffle. They fidget and fart around, And so having some great care and having that horse very confident in you to where you can help settle it with the hackamore helps. But generally, I can work with it maybe 3 or 4 days on the ground, leading it around, whatnot, and then ride them. I do it pretty slow. I start everything, things that they know. It's almost like restart. I mean, basically, the horse knows and is comfortable with you being on its back, but you're basically starting over.
Yes, sir.
It goes a lot quicker than originally. But, we give the horse time to learn to pack that. Because our deal is, I have this asked a lot of me in the workshops. It's like, well, when can I pick up on the rein? Well, the point is not to pick up on the rein. It's not to pull on the horse. It's to have that as a balancer. All right? It's to have a wall to push the energy from behind to a spot, and instead of having to hold that like a modern dressage rider or even a classical dressage rider, to have to hold that with a certain amount of direct contact through hands, no matter how good or light they are. Well, that doesn't work cowboy. You need to be able to ride them one-handed. You need to be able to rope. You need to be able to do things. So what we want to do is take that same idea of having the horse be on the bridle. Instead of being on the bridle, be with the bridle and be with the balance. So we push the horse to it. It finds the balance. It learns that that supports it. That allows it to carry itself in balance and helps the horse stay. So you can be on a loose rein and not have contact with the horse all the time. And the slightest movement gives the horse signals it too. Of course, this always comes through the body, through the reins to the bit, not the other way around. So that's the idea with the two rein. Gives the horse enough time to figure out. It's got to be in a certain posture to be able to hold that. You know, you'll see, well, those bits are too heavy and the horse slips out. Well, if the horse is lifting its neck to make movements, to suck back, to roll back, to spin, whatever you're doing, if it's having to depart and it has to throw its neck and head up, well, that horse is not horse doesn't know how to use its body. And so it's using its head and neck instead of engaging its hind end and driving that forward, which would just elevate around every vertebrae in the back. They're broke somewhere. We don't want to break our horses anywhere. We don't want them broke at the pole or broke at the withers. We want every vertebrae to take a slight amount. They don't bend that much anyway. Every piece to connect the horse. It's about connection, not disengagement. And so driving from behind into that support that gives a horse enough balance where it can hold it together without us actually having to physically hold it up, by directly.
Yes. So to me, it's the ultimate self-carriage tool. That's what you're really describing. It is self-carriage. And I've always found it ironic that the dressage, the discipline that touts self-carriage, the way they go about it, they're almost anti-self-carriage in the practical nature of the way they ride. A horse can't carry himself if you're carrying him all the time, right? You have to let go of him at some point. So
yeah, he's got to learn to not do that without you. You can help him, but they support him all the time. And what happens when they let go? The horses shoot forward, and come totally disconnected.
Yes, sir.
In a stock horse in a real ranching situation, we can't hold collection all the time. The horse it works in degrees of collection. When it's really working, it needs a higher degree of collection. When it's just traveling, it doesn't. And we need to stay out of their way. And so, this gives us the ability to, in a moment, change the horse's balance from a loose, long horse to a gathered. In this system, the first step to every maneuver is to gather. The first thing we gather is ourselves. We gather ourselves, the horse gathers with us, we do something, and then we may let them out or we may keep them in a fairly collected state because we're going to do more things. But that ability to gather the horse up, do something, and then leave it alone and allow it to do it on its own, I think is what this system is about to me.
One of the things, you haven't really gotten to this part of that video yet, but I really come from more of an engineering type background. And so I break leverage down a lot. And I've always felt that there is a sort of a chip on the shoulder of a lot of the vaquero guys that it's a signal bit and not a leverage bit. And I certainly understand what they mean by that. But at the same time, not acknowledging the leverage aspect of the bit doesn't allow you to understand how the bit works, because all of the mechanics work off of leverage. It's the reason that the signal exists. It's the single easiest way to change quickness or slowness of action in a bit. It's what the balance comes down to. All of that is dictated by the mechanics of levers. And that may be a little more of an analytical look at it than what most people want to do, and then that's perfectly fine. But like if we're building bits and we don't understand that race car mentality about what putting this rear end does, then there's no way that we can fine tune a bit or anything because we don't know what adjusting this does. The science of levers goes all the way back to Archimedes 400 years before Christ. He wrote the first mathematical textbook on it. The levers were used building the pyramid. So the math of it and the physics is ancient. It's not new or cutting edge by any stretch of the imagination. So to me, like,
well, and it's provable. It's science. It's mechanical science.
Yeah.
And so it's something that's a consistent. You can't consistently say about feel, which is what most people talk about a lot. Is feel. Well, yeah, feel is great, but if you don't understand the mechanics of the piece of equipment you're using, the actual mechanical facts,
yes, sir.
These aren't things that have black and white. They're really straight. And so understanding these things, like you say, what makes it quick? What makes a bit slow? The distance between where the curb strap and the cannon bar are located is no different than, using a breaker bar where your leverage point, where you put your log, the further up that is, the slower that's going to be, the less power it will put on one point of contact.
Yes, sir.
And so, I get that too. We try to use it. It's used that as a signal, but it definitely has there's a leverage or a contact aspect to it, which
even before, I mean, so I kind of broke it down in the video a little differently than what I've seen it done other places. And honestly, the hackamore was a big part of why I decided to word it the way that I worded it. So I break it down into a signal phase and then a leverage phase. And signal is basically everything that occurs before the curb strap comes tight. But the bit is still acting as a lever in that phase. It still rotates about a fulcrum, which is the cannons and that is what is the major determining of how fast the signal is going to play out and so forth. And that is also a mirror image to the hackamore. The hackamore's fulcrum is the nose buttons that you were talking about where the hanger ties in, and it's going to rotate about that point. The difference with the hackamore is once you have exhausted the free movement and you're now tight, you have no leverage. There's no mechanical advantage to that apparatus. And to me, where we get into the two-rein phase, if you don't have your horse finding the hole in the hackamore, the game of operation, like you were talking about, then there's no concept for him there of understanding the balance yet. But you also could put a hackamore on that balance is contrary to the spade that you have on, and your horse is getting conflicting signals of where he's supposed to be. The neutral positions for the Bosalita at that point and the spade need to be similar, I think. So I think that's one of those areas where the Theodore can play. Like if you have no Theodore on typically in that spot, so that can change the neutral position of that Bosalita at that point. I know we're kind of splitting hairs here, but I mean, why talk to an expert if you're not going to split hairs? So,
all right. Well, I think that's those are definitely justifiable things that need to be thought about. And when you see just the action, people also talk about most bits. People are thinking about leverage and how the leverage works, but they're not taking into account, why do I like a minimum of 4-inch spoon, right? So if we take our fulcrum, which is the cannon bar, right, and we have our spoon is the length of what's below the fulcrum, that's going to change the amount of leverage in that bit, not only where the curb strap aligns, but because that has as much area above the engaging part where the reins connect, that's going to slow that down quite a really, as far as a leverage, it's like having a bar where the fulcrum is in the middle. Like you a pry bar where your fulcrum where you only have a log in the center, typically becomes 1-to-1.
Yes. So I don't want to be contrary to you, but that actually works a little bit differently. So when we get closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, like with a taller spoon, that actually speeds up the action of the bit. And I would suspect, there you are. Okay. So I would suspect like a Santa Barbara is actually a very fast action bit, where a Las Cruces is a slower action bit. And I tend to find that higher level riders get along with the faster action bits better because they have more feel, and it's a bit that has more feel. So for instance, and this gets complicated, it's very difficult to describe by word of mouth. That's why I think the video is a good tool, because we draw the illustrations. But like if you had a seesaw, that's a first class lever. And in the signal phase of any leverage bit, it acts as a first class lever. That actually changes when the curb chain comes tight and we end the signal phase. But for signal, this is how it works. So if you envision two kids on a seesaw and they're both 10 feet out from the fulcrum, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. The same weight would be lifted. If one of those kids moved in 5 feet and we now have a 2-to-1 ratio, the distance that child would be lifted would be half the distance if he's on the outside. So if we're looking at the arc of the circle and so forth, and that's essentially where our signal comes from. So if you vision the seesaw moving up and down like this, one half is the shank of the bit, one half is the purchase or the port. If we have a 1-to-1 ratio, the shaded area that it would make when it moves would be equal. But if we move that kid in 5 feet, the shaded area on the short side would now be half as, or actually a lot less than half as large. So I feel like that's probably why you like a Santa Barbara, because you can do very, very subtle hand movements and you still get a lot of shading with the seesaw in essence. So again, I'm not trying to be contrary to you, but there's a very consistent mathematical relationship there as to how the speed of action works. One of the places that gets more complicated is when the curb chain comes tight, the center of rotation for the lever actually changes. So it moves to the top ring of the bit. The headstall and the curb chain essentially immobilize that point and rotation stops. And now the place we're putting force is on the cannons of the bit or the bars of the horse's mouth. And it actually becomes mechanically a second class lever at that stage. So there's a significant shift in the physics that occurs whenever we get into the leverage phase. And one of the reasons I think that's, again, we're splitting hairs, maybe people don't practically need to know this, but mechanically speaking, that lever becomes more powerful the way you do the math. So if you had a 3-to-1, let's say an 8-inch cheek with 6 inches of shank and 2 inches of purchase, in the signal phase, that's a 3-to-1 ratio bit. But when it transitions to a second class lever, when we actually come tight, actually becomes a 4-to-1 ratio bit. So if you pull 10 pounds on the reins, you don't have 30 pounds in the horse's mouth, you have 40. It becomes 25%, a third more powerful than people realize, which again is a lot easier to express in a video than it is just talking by the mouth. So like the Las Cruces, I'm not a real big fan of that cheek style either, mainly because of the balance, because it does put a horse on the vertical. And as soon as you take up any slack on the reins, he's going to get behind the vertical. And there's a whole host of reasons why I'm not a fan of that. But I consider that more of a parade style bit. It's pretty to look at, but for riding in rough country and having a horse watch cattle, it's not practical in any way, shape, or form.
I want to ask one question on that. Why would you think Las Cruces would be slower than a Santa Barbara?
Typically, because it's a higher leverage bit, it generally has a longer shank. If it doesn't, if the ratios are the same, then it's not. But just typically what you see, it tends to be a longer shanked bit. Yes, sir.
Generally, the mouthpieces, at least on the old ones, they were built at vertical. The balance point, or where it would lay without touching, was vertical. And like you say, would get them behind vertical when engaged. I think one of the aspects, like you say, rotation has so much to do. Once we make contact, it's the rotation has that. And one of the big differences I find in California bits, or at least spade bits, was the braces. And that's where I think some of the the importance of braces is the horse can control rotation a certain amount. And that's one of the reasons I think that it's very misunderstood about hands with the spade. If you just take a hold of the reins and pull back on a spade bit, I mean, you might as well pull on their tail. It does not have, like if you take a half breed or you take a regular grazing bit or anything else, and you get a hold of them, you're going to have a lot more feel of that horse getting behind the bridle. It's very dull. They have to be to feel for the signals, because the horse can stop the rotation. If the horse takes a hold of that bit, it's supposed to be allow the horse to take control of the bit. And I think that's one of the misconceptions of spade bit. It's not about creating more control. It's about allowing the horse to protect itself. And so, as you know, roping and riding, and especially this country, is very steep. Coastal California is very steep and very rough country. And they went through this process. And one of the reasons I started teaching was I was like, it wouldn't make much sense. Let's do this. Let's go through this whole process. So we're going to start the horse in the hackamore so that we don't hurt its mouth. We're not going to put a bridle in its mouth until its mouth is fully set, until its teeth are fully developed, all its jaws fully developed. We're never going to put anything in its mouth. And then we're never going to lead the horse by the reins. We're not going to do all these things to protect the horse. And then we're going to put a bit in that is harsh. Doesn't make any sense, does it?
No, sir.
So then we're going to put something in. So we're going to go through this very long, slow process. And then at the end, we're going to put this vicious piece of metal in their mouth. Mm-hmm. And so what it does, though, it does allow the horse to protect itself. The horse can take a hold of it and it can stop the rotation. And the reason that we have to have good hands is if you hang on it, the horse will learn to protect itself. Just like the hackamore. If you hang on a hackamore, you don't have anything. The horse will just learn. It's just a piece of rawhide. I don't care how much authority you have in your hackamore. If you just hang on it, they just take it away, and they'll hold on to it and push into it. There's not enough force. That's the downside of this style. The upside is that you can push the body up to it without fear. Is that you can drive from behind, you can drive the motion up the horse. It has enough wall to catch that motion and create that collection, but not so much that the horse gets scared to. It's pretty hard to drive a horse to something that it's scared of. You have to use a lot more force in your impulsion to drive a horse to something that it's afraid of.
Yes, sir.
And so you end up having to use whips or whatever,
It's
the more.
The being on the hot wire fence principle again. You don't approach that fence quickly. You're always drawn back. It bit you. So the spade has so much surface area, like you say, there really isn't a sharp bite to it. And I'm sure you've had to do this too. But if you do get a horse that has been ridden with a lot of contact in a spade bit, there's probably nothing that can dull one like that and take all of the sensitivity out of them, because they're so dull to so much signal that, it takes a Mack truck to get something done at that point in time.
Yeah, they do. They will lose their sensitivity from that bit. And then we come down to the thing of, then you come down to that point where you either have to start over and develop that horse's sensitivity to your movement of your body, to the seat movement, the change of that. far as I'm concerned, our seat and that bit don't work any differently. We have a neutral position. We have a position that's easy that goes with the horse, and then we adjust from there. To me, that's the most important. It's also the hardest thing to teach, as you know. People always, what's in front of you is easy. What's behind you and underneath you is a lot more difficult to associate into riding, and especially into teaching, because most people just want to deal with what's in front of them. And we get a lot of head and neck movement. I mean, how many horses you've been on, you can pull that head and neck anywhere, but their feet are not, their body is not coming through, right?
Yes. To me, that ties in with the bad feel we were talking about earlier, like the vertical flexion. The head and neck is on a hinge, but it's loosely going in without resistance in the wrong direction. It wasn't connected to what it was supposed to be connected to.
Right.
Well, you talked a little bit earlier about the conformation of the horse's mouth, and I do want to get into your clinics and stuff here. So I take it in your clinics, you are frequently bidding horses up for the first time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so what things are you looking for specifically in a horse's conformation, or what the mouth you have to deal with that makes you choose this one versus that one, or so forth? What are you looking for there?
Well, a lot of times with spade bits, I want to watch the horse go. We watch the people ride the horse. We ride the horse ourselves. And most of the time, it's a matter of that horse has not created any collection itself. Okay, it doesn't have posture to really work well in a spade bit. And so we try to help people determine, let's see, have you developed any collection, any of this posture to where the horse can carry something in balance, right? A lot of times if it's just hanging in their face, that's not a bridle horse. So the horse has to develop that posture. Once we see where that horse's posture can be developed to, we'll take a bit, and if you hold it between your hands, and when it starts rolling out of your hand at that angle, when that bit starts leaving through gravity between your hands, that's the balance point of that bit. And so we'll look for a bit that kind of matches the balance point of how that horse wants to carry its head in engagement. That's one of the things I look for. I have bits that are kind of different degrees of how straight up they are. I ride a lot of Andalusian horses. They tend to be more straight up and down. They don't need a whole lot ahead of vertical, as far as, because their necks come up higher. They're naturally built in a higher. The Spanish horses tend to be that way. One of the reasons I gravitate to them is because it's not something where if you take a horse that's downhill, he at least needs to balance. He needs to change his posture at least to level, right? So he needs to be reaching up far enough with his hind feet in his movement, whether he's loose or gathered, that he's not traveling in downhill. He's done, we're adjusting the front end load from, on a Spanish horse is probably 60-40. On a lot of quarter horses, probably 70-30, that downward push, how much weight they're carrying on their front end. We need to adjust that. We need to bring them up to where their heart and girth is coming up. So working in balance, you have to have the horse to a point of elevation that it can hang something on it that will help balance, right? It won't work if they're, and so that's the hack-a-mole process. And so a lot of the times when the person has reached that level, then we'll talk about putting them in the bit. And a lot of times we'll do it, maybe beforehand, so the person has time to prepare and order the right type of bit. If we can get the horse into a place and then bit it a couple of times through the course of a workshop, then at least they'll have an idea what they're looking for when they go to buy a bit. Because they're not cheap. And so you don't want to
not cheap.
You don't want to buy a lot of them. So that's kind of what we're trying to develop. I think so much of people are talking about changing bits or something, but so much of it is about developing the horse to a point where you're going to be successful in that style that you're riding. A lot of a lot of things we do, in cutting and stuff, that wouldn't be as important. Of course, those things are important. We know as further you get, but that bit is really not influencing that horse very much in its actual job.
Yes, I would. Yeah, like for a cutting horse,
Probably.
Bad choice.
Right.
I'm sorry, I lost you there. What was that?
I said it's more likely getting in the horse's way.
Yeah,
a bit.
Yeah,
I watch so many cutters when they pull off the bridle, they work so much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think cutting horses really, to see cattle, they have to have their nose out significantly farther than most other horses, just because of the distance that they're viewing right there. Right. And I think that's why grazing bits have been kind of the go-to for so long, because that type of bit balances in that manner where they can have their head where they can see the cattle, and not like if you had a spade bit that's asking him to come to the vertical all the time, he's constantly in conflict of obeying the bit or doing his job, and that's got to take something away from his performance. Even if it's 2 or 3%, that might be the difference between a check and not a check. So
right. Well, that's the difference between reined horses and horses that are working. They're set up and they know their job and they're trained to do that, but they're virtually working on their own. We want to have the best of both worlds, because cowboy, so much of it is roping and stuff like that, where we need that horse to be together and we need it to be with us.
Yes.
Pretty close connection. But I think a lot of that too is where that horse is developed to. The beauty of the spade bit is too, the horse can learn to hold on to it enough that he can move where he needs to, but it takes time. It's not something that, is done overnight. The reason that I used to do a lot of reined cow horses and stuff like that, and we train them quite a bit differently than I do now. What I like about this system is that in a spade bit, they start really dull. They're really, it's quite a quiet feel of a bit. Once they get over the initial, fiddling around, getting used to the weight and stuff, it's quite dull and slow. But as time goes on, it becomes, if used fairly correctly, they just get lighter and lighter and lighter throughout their life. And that's one of the reasons that always me searching is I could get horses when they're 3-year-old year and stuff. They were good. They were great. We go to snaffle bit futurity or whatever. But as those horses progressed, that progression, you never got the same feel. They got duller and duller and required more and more to create the same thing.
Yes, sir.
And so I feel like for me, this is a very practical progression, but it's a progression that keeps elevating. And of course, the better you get at it, the better, it requires a lot of thought and skill, as all do.
Yes,
I don't care what it's like, you can say that some things you can get to a little quicker, but overall, people go, well, this works faster. No, that gets to a point faster. If you're developing a horse, that's a lifelong deal. Or as long as you're riding that horse, you're either developing or tearing them down.
I was having a discussion with a young lady at our Louisiana Equine Council meeting yesterday. She had sent a horse out to be started with a young hotshot reining trainer around here, and he had come very close to telling her that her mare was so badly off that she needed to euthanize her. And a large part of that was because he wasn't able to get her spinning a hole in the ground in 30 days. And normally that's where he gets to. And I was thinking, goodness gracious. I mean, I'm sure I could do that if I wanted to, but I don't want to. That's what I learned right there, is that guy's not riding a horse for me. And he I don't want him working for me either. If that's even a goal that's in front of him, is 30 days they need to be spinning a hole in the ground. He needs a little
and
more.
That's it. We all get different perspectives on riding and what's important to us, I guess. And I think that's why there's a lot of people out there doing different things. But, it comes down to, I'm not going to have a bunch of people following what I do. I know that, but hopefully I'll get a few that, they care for their horses, and their concern is to become better for their horses. That's what it comes down to. We use this system. I use this system because I believe it's very natural for horses. I don't have to, if I ride correctly and I use the equipment correctly, they understand it right away. It's very easy. It's more of a herding style. It's almost like, it's just like herding a cow, really. I mean, we do things. We don't get ahead of cattle and horses and pull them around, just like we don't get ahead of, all this people turning away and looking somewhere ahead of their horse, and they don't even see their horse. And then, they have one option to drag it around. I get a lot of grief for saying, no, just wait. The horse needs to go first. Well, this style, it has Spanish, roots, like every horse in the Americas for at one point. Okay. It has a Spanish root, but they developed something different here in California because of what they were doing. It's really based on herding. And
that was one question that I had for you.
As the Spanish did in the long run.
Yes, sir.
Because what they did, if you did this work afoot and then you got on a horse, if you moved horses afoot, the first thing you would do is not get ahead of your horse and then drag it behind you. You would herd it somewhere. And so it's very well based on that. So horses understand it, and they do it easily. They doesn't have to drill because it's fairly simple to, once you get enough control of your own physical self to refine your signal.
One question that I had for you there, what does go back into the history, and most of the time when I ask a question, I think I have a pretty good idea of the answer. This is one of those I have no idea where this may lead, but so I know from my cutting roots, when I was still doing the apprenticing in the late 90s and early 2000s, and let me pause. I have a dog problem now. Colt, you let him out so he quits whining at the door, please. My son is sick and he's laid up in here with headphones on, and he's oblivious to the world around him at the moment.
Oh, he doesn't have COVID, does he?
I think it's just a cold. I think people can still get the cold and flu. But,
yeah, they still exist.
I think so. Okay. So what I was going to say, when I was in the apprenticing stages in cutting in the late 90s and the early 2000s, that was sort of a period when we were starting to have an influx of California trainers moving to Texas. And what I always felt like in that point was you would see those guys come, and most of the shows in cutting, the big ones anyway, are at Will Rogers in Fort Worth. And so you're working Texas cattle. And the feel that I always had was that the California guys' horses were used to working softer cattle. And when they came to Texas and they had a little more Brahman influence, a little grittier cattle that would challenge your horse a little bit more, their horses just weren't used to that, and they would get a little bit lost. And I think those guys started gravitating this way to sort of be in the same environment that everybody else was in, and then their horses were a little more used to the type of cattle. Now, I may be wrong on that, but that's always sort of the feeling that I've had about it. So what would you say, being more of a historical guy, what influence did the cattle have on the way going, training the horses and the equipment that was used and so forth?
Well, I think it had a big difference. I think one of the reasons that, you'll see a lot of guys gravitate down there was the availability of cattle. And so I don't think your cattle are any wilder there than they are here as far as when they're fresh. But I think a lot of times guys from California, when they have to keep their cattle longer. Okay. And the availability, they don't have that's one of the beauties of down there, is that you have a lot, you have the ability to get on fresh cattle a lot more. Here, I think it had a huge difference. This started with the hide and tallow trade. And so these were pretty wild cattle. And the fact that they would harvest the hide as a 3-year-old.
Yes,
and so they may mark and brand them, but they're 3 years old and wild as deer. And so the effect was a lot different. And a lot of things, one of my mentors, Ray Ordaway, they had a different style of cutting, right? It wasn't a head-to-head cutting. And so historically, they would work side to head, right? And outside, you'll end up doing that a lot more. There's not the ability of fences, so it's ride to the stirrup in a straight line, create a partition between the cow and the herd when you're sorting something out. And so it's a lot more ride the cow, your stirrup to their head type of riding, a lot straighter than head to head, which is more of a sandbox. You have a bigger area to cut things. So you've got to stay in more straight lines. Plus you're outside and you don't have good ground. Right. So it tended to be a lot more about the horse going someplace straight, stopping hard and rolling back over its hocks instead of getting down low and pushing off its front end. And so your hind end, that's what developed a lot more, I think, in California, and was less specialized. A cutting horse on slick grassy ground doesn't do very well.
Yes.
If you're outside and you're on, and here the grass is slick when it's wet, but it's really slick when it's dry.
Okay. That's not something I would have expected. Yes.
It's super, on hillsides and stuff. When you're down here, you slide down these hills. I mean, it's very kind of a slick area. So a lot of that front end push off was not. They need to rock back on their hocks and roll their front end around. And so it's a different style of riding. And I don't know if that had an influence. I think cutters, they're probably following the people that are winning at cutting. And most of those were in Texas. And so
there's no doubt that while I don't think cutting is as fad driven as some of the other disciplines like reining, for instance, there's no doubt that what it has evolved into is less than practical in all aspects. I am fortunate. All of the trainers that I worked for were kind of cowboys first. And so like we were using the 2-year-olds to doctor cattle. And I mean, they would open gates. I mean, they were kind of ranch horses first and then show horses as they develop. I know there are some other trainers out there where their horses never leave the arena. I actually had a customer that brought one for me to tune, and he got there a little bit early. And I didn't have the cattle up yet. So I said, well, just hop on your horse and come out with me and we'll gather the cattle. His horse had a complete and total nervous breakdown out there in the pasture. He had to get off of him and lead him back to the barn after I had pinned the cattle. And the thought to me, this horse had won about $10,000. How you could train a cutting horse, show horse that couldn't walk into a 20-acre pasture and pin a few heifers just blows my mind. But apparently someone managed to do it. So,
yeah, I think the ability, sometimes show horses often lose the ability to do real jobs. That's one of the things that's always been important to me. I was cowboy. I was it for a long, long time. And so, once a job loses its effectiveness, like I'm big on collection. I'm huge on developing classical lateral movements and using lateral movements to develop, because I think it's the only way you can develop a truly one-handed horse, because you have to shape them and you can't pull their heads around. So you need to learn to shape the body and set the horse up physically through its body. But, a lot of that collection can be a two-edged sword too. I mean, that's, you can over collect and that horse loses function.
Yes,
the ability, it becomes to where it's just too spring loaded, if you will. Airs above the ground are great unless you need to do something, and then airs above the ground are very efficient. So
yes.
the ability for the horse to be able to do that is great, but you have to keep it in a practical sense. That's the one thing I've always tried to do is you got to keep it real. And to me, always it's about the practicality. I'll try to protect my horse and bring him along as good as I can, but when stuff needs to be done, it needs to be done. Yes. And so that horse has got to be, it's got to learn to take a joke and be a little forgiving. Yes. Because stuff happens in real life. And, we can talk all this fantasy what we want, but as we all know, we're going to pull on horses.
Yeah.
We are.
The ideal world, and then there's the real world. Yes, sir.
And people get a lot of that. That's what you hear, especially in the California style. Everybody's looking for this mystical. I mean, it's not a Walt Disney movie. Horses are horses. They do funny things, And so, in real life, things will happen. It's just try to minimize those as much as you can. I mean, that's my philosophy on it. And we're all in a learning progression, or we should be, hopefully, because if you didn't, why would you do this so long? Yes. No, I've been doing this time, and it's like if you're not in a learning progression, you might as well do something else, something that makes money. Because as you know, you can be really successful in the horse business and not make anything.
Yes, sir. Because you're usually working pretty hard to break even most years, and COVID definitely didn't.
The overhead is
back to what you said a second ago. I'm not going to name him on here, but one of your counterparts I like to make a little bit of fun of. To me, he gets pretty big into the welfare of the horse side of things, and I'm kind of thinking the whole time. And yet, in your living room, you've got a huge painting of a horse roping a bear, and that was not, where was welfare of the horse at that moment? So, yeah. But
yeah, there's certain things, It's like, if you're really that into it, are you going to rope a cow? Mm-hmm. And when it comes down to it, I mean, it's a job. It's about keeping things alive. Our whole deal is stockmanship can be done, but it's for the benefit of it. And we have events, but they're to develop skills to where you can be better at it. And maybe, everything comes out a little less scathed. And so keeping the stress down is very important. But you know what? Life has stress. It has tension. It has things involved in it that eventually they're going to have to learn to cope with, at least on certain levels. And
that's the defining characteristic between one that's green and one that's broke. The one that's broke can handle the rough spots too. The one that's green, you're not quite sure what might happen here in the next minute. So, well, I just have two more questions. I know we've been talking a long time. When we had done the pre-phone call about this, we talked a little bit about some of the physical differences in the horses then versus now, and the bits that you would find and mouth width and so forth. So would you talk a little bit about that? I kind of call BS sometimes when I hear these guys that say they're riding a 150-year-old bit. I'm kind of wondering how the hell they put that on a quarter horse, because it's probably an inch too narrow, So what are your thoughts?
Well, there is quite a bit of difference in the bit sizes. I actually have a bit from the 1890s that I ride quite a bit, but it was a wide one. I don't know what it was built for, but it's a wider mouth. It's got about a 5 1/8 inch mouth on it. And I ride it in an Azteca horse who has a fairly narrow mouth, really. But what's strange is the bits had the width of, a lot of the old bits were 4 1/4, even a 4.5 wide. They looked like they were on ponies or something, but they weren't. They were horse bits. And generally a cheek was not over 7 inches. So they weren't quite as long. A lot of times on a 7-inch cheek, you'll have a hard time not having their chains in your mouth nowadays. Horses just have longer mouths. But what's amazing to me in studying a lot of them is that where the braces connect to the spoon was sometimes 2 1/8 inch wide there. Well, most horses now, if you measure in there where that mouthpiece could fit comfortably inside of the premolars, because that's where most of these bits only reach to the premolars,
it's not going to work. That horse is going to have that bit in its teeth all the time. And definitely some changes in the physicality, much bigger horses with different mouths and palates. And I think a lot of that has to do with different feed. If you look at California saddles here, we have some great museums in Santa Barbara. Mm-hmm. And the Santa Barbara Carriage Museum, you go look at the saddles. I mean, they're so narrow, they wouldn't fit anything we ride, yes, unless it was a thoroughbred off the track, maybe, as far as width. But they didn't feed any hay. So during the big drought times here in the 1870s, they lost thousands of horses. They were running herds of horses off the cliffs into the ocean to save grass for the cows.
Yes, sir.
Different times.
Yes, sir. You got to do what you got to do sometimes. Hard choices and hard men.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that tips another. A lot of people tend to think of the Wade saddle, and I believe you do ride a bunch of Wades as a traditional type of a saddle, but I think it was actually invented in the 1930s or 40s.
Yeah.
It's not as conventional. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you tend to ride Wades more, or do you have some different styles?
I do. I ride Wades, and they're based on an old saddle. They're based on a Visalia style saddle. Basically, the only real similarity is that they're A-forks.
Yes, sir.
And so what they have is a little more bar coverage, so it dissipates weight in a larger area. And the center of gravity from your horn is lower than, say, an old A-fork. They would be pretty tall.
Yeah,
those guys are using fairly skinny horns and rawhide ropes. So you're not dallying off on, you would say, a lot of people using rubber or cotton or something like that. These ropes, you have to almost continuously dally to keep something stopped. If you watch the guys in Sonora, even to this day, they dally on brass with riatas, and they're, it's continuously keeping wrapping. Things are going places. And we still use that. We still run rope, but the bigger horn base gives you a little more control, a little more ability to stop things. But that tradition is still basically the same. And so for those aspects is why I choose it. It also, the seat can be built. I want the center of my body, the center of my seat, maybe the seam of my jeans to be my balance point. And so I want a saddle that's built with that pocket in mind. The center of the saddle is the lowest point. That just depends on, you can build any saddle like that, but the Wade seems to work. It's a little narrower. If you're riding all day, it doesn't quite split you as much as like an association or something like that. So it allows you to be a little more comfortable, in my opinion. That's the reason I choose them. I don't think, if you're going to be Visalia, you'd be more of a 3B traditional saddle. And a 5/8. Those guys, they rode a 5/8 or a center fire rigging too. So that doesn't fit on modern horses either. When you put hay in their bellies, then where your girth groove is quite a bit more forward. So I ride a 3/4. Things change and adapt to the animals we ride. So when we say about tradition, I'm looking at the principles of the science of the riding. That's the tradition that I follow, or what makes sense for the gear. It's not really written down. If I want to study classical dressage, I've got 1,000 years of literature I can go through. Yeah, it's great, different writers and stuff. But if you want to do this, there's nothing written by the actual
people. Yes. Well, like you said, a lot of them
or Mexican California vaqueros, right? California has 3 phases: Spanish California, Mexican California, and Anglo California. Well, there's not much written from the guys that actually developed the tools, but you can see how the tools work. And then what I did to learn to change from what I did from, say, rein cow horses, I just reverse engineered all the equipment and how the equipment worked with a steady balance point and signal. Then I tried to develop that in my seat and my body. And when I did that, things started working the way that I'd always imagined they could.
Yes, sir. I guess that would be the last question we had alluded to earlier about sort of the fork in the road of dressage and the vaquero style. And to me, that's kind of the Doma Classica versus Doma Vaquera. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm having a senior moment there. And to me, also, there is, and again, this is something I don't know the answer to, but there was a period, and there still is a period, of having the Goroka pole and more fighting type of cattle. And it's my understanding that somewhat during the tallow trade days that was still used. It wasn't necessarily a reata time, but I may well be wrong about that. So I guess that's another aspect of where the like with the Goroka pole and lariat rope, both you have to have one hand on the reins and you have to have one hand to do what you're doing. In dressage, even in the classical dressage, there are loads of videos on YouTube of Nuno Oliveira doing piaffe with one hand on the reins, and he may have a cigar or something in the other, and he just looks like he's just chilling out on a Tuesday afternoon riding a horse. It's not nearly as uptight as some of what we see these days. So do you have an answer for me there of specifically when that fork? And I know it's probably not like Tuesday, the 7th of February, 19, or what, but what are your thoughts on that? And am I wrong about the Goroka and the tallow trade, and it stayed across the pond, or what?
Well, the Goroka was, primarily used when Spain came to New Spain and conquered Mexico, New Spain, which is Mexico now. A few things happened. What happened was, at one point, all cattle were owned by the church. Okay. During the mission period, all cattle were owned by the church, one brand. As more people came to New Spain, they started giving grants, and grants were to individuals. And so there was open range. And what was happened was they used the Goroka with a hockey knife. But with all these brands, there was a big deal on how do we separate, how do we keep things separate? Because basically once you hock one, it's done. The deal is done. And so, as they developed these herds and they ran in common and branding became a thing, roping was developed. So the development of that came from that. Okay. So there was no roping before late 1500s in New Spain was developed. So horns developed on saddles, and then we became, a roping society. That's where it all started. As it moved up into California, the Goroka is pretty much gone. They didn't have maguey. So if you look at Mexico, right, the primary ropes used in Mexico then and today were maguey. Well, maguey doesn't grow up here.
It's a grass fiber that they were making the ropes out of. So it's a
right. It's grass. It's the same plant they make tequila out of. It's agave, a type of agave. So the maguey plant, that's what they would build ropes out of. Twisted out of there, or horsehair. Horsehair was used often for roping back then as well. So once that developed, first they were tied off. Then they developed horns on their saddles. If you look at every different Spanish colony, it's a little bit different. In Argentina, they never changed. In Chile, they never developed past that being tied off. They still rope, but now they're still tied to the tail or a cinching. As it came into New Spain, they developed horns on saddle. That became a much more efficient way to handle cattle in bigger country. That's the other thing you got to realize is the size change. Up in California, because they didn't have the maguey, they switched to rawhide. So braided rawhide ropes, riatas, that's what we use, la riata, where lariat comes from, la riata. Right?
Yes, sir.
So,
and with a riata rawhide, there's no way you can be tied on. That has to be because it'll break, right? So the dallying and all.
Well, you have to be pretty careful. A lot of people, they used to even tie on with rawhide ropes, They run them through the fork. Even in early rodeos in Salinas, you'd see vaqueros would go there and do steer tripping with
rawhide top.
riatas. Yeah. A riata can take a lot of pull. It just can't take much of a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So that's hence the running of the rope. You can't just throw your slack in the air and pop something over. So that became kind of the thing. And here, they didn't have a lot of metal for a long time. It was quite a trip to come into Alta California. So there wasn't a lot of metal. So when they eventually brought the indigenous people into working, it was against the law, for one thing, to put them on horseback. So they were breaking Spanish law when they put indigenous people on horseback. Because you got to remember the native people they came up through were the Comanche. Those are the people through, as they moved north, pretty warlike tribes. In California, you had a whole different vibe here. There's that laid back California thing that started long before we got here. They were way more relaxed because there was plenty of food, right? It all comes down to how much food you can produce. So if you have a mild climate where you're not having to fight for everything, things grow, things thrive. And so that developed through there. And that's where it became more, the garrocha was dispensed with. Roping became a big deal. And the riata was a very integral part in development of the system too. This system is designed to rope. So it became from, hawking cattle and crippling them to catching them, stretching them out, slitting their throat and taking their hides off, collecting the tallow. And then the ships would come around, and that became, the whole basis for the California economy was hide and tallow trade. And so that lasted for a long time. And most of the missions during the mission period ran, between 18,000 and 25,000 head. There was 21 missions. And so hundreds and hundreds of thousands of head of cattle. And so it was kind of the perfect storm for creating stock horses.
Yes, sir.
And, but everything developed from the hackamore to the bit. And that's important because I think the bits were developed from the way the hackamore worked, not vice versa.
Well, I definitely, everyone appreciates the spade, but the hackamore is it's a part that should be more visited, I think. Anyway, that could be a whole other episode. We could just talk about the hackamore, I think. But anyway, we may be the only two that find it interesting. So.
The hackamore process really is amazing, and how my goal has always been, if I could get a horse as light in the bridle as I do in the hackamore, because it's amazing how intuitive and light that horse gets to you in the hackamore. And the process of bridling, sometimes it's like, we talked about cutting horses earlier. It's until you stay with it long enough, and most people don't have the patience to stay with a bit long enough until it really develops and does what it's supposed to do. It's frustrating because you had something better and then you kind of took yourself backwards a ways. But once you hang in there, you actually get to another level, a higher level than you ever were in the hackamore, and it's more sustainable.
Yes, sir. I think I've probably taken up enough of your time on this Sunday. I certainly appreciate it. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to get to, or you feel like we just knocked it out of the park here, or what? Well,
I think we did, we got a pretty good gist on everything, I guess.
Okay.
And so it's one of those subjects, it's like any horsemanship. You can go on and on till you're picking the pepper out of crap. And then I think sometimes we get lost in the dissection.
Well, let me ask you this. This is just one of those questions I have that I don't mean to offend you, but let's say that you brought a horse into a spade bit, but you weren't traditional. Like let's say you threw a snaffle in there at some point, or you did maybe start with a half breed and work your way up or something. Can you still call that a bridle horse in your mind? Does that change things, or?
No, it doesn't. I think technique is something that's developed by individuals. I think It's more about, how that horse looks and how it works with itself.
Mhm.
If that horse is working like a bridle horse, and I can see that it's doing its job, and they're getting along well. When it comes down to it, that's the bottom line, most important thing. And so some people, I don't think through history, like I say, Ray Ordway, who talked to me, said, some guys were just amazing in the hackamore. Some guys were really great in the two-rein. And sometimes they were only good in the bridle. And so a person finds that degree where they can communicate the best with their horse. I don't have any problem with that. The only time I have a problem with it is when they're, abusing the horse to get there.
Yes.
I think, I don't care what you use, you can use a piece of baling twine as far as I'm concerned. If you're getting done what you want to be done, we all have I teach a lot of people that you want to achieve a certain thing, a certain level in a certain way. And I think to go for that, you have to commit yourself to doing it that way for a long enough period of time to become good at it. When I get to that level, either I'll be dead or maybe I'll look for something else. I don't know. Right.
Yes,
but
sir.
Until I get there, I'm going to continue doing what I do, because I've never found anything personally, and I've done things a lot of different ways for many, many years, that I can feel it in the horses as much as this. I think there's something, and that's why, we go to this effort to try to not let it die. I think if it may never be mainstream, but I think at least people need to see that this is it's a good way to work with horses and keep it alive enough that I think there'd be some few people practicing. It's like everything else, comes and goes in popularity.
Yes, sir.
In fashion. Things come back into fashion. It was gone for a long time. And especially, I think this balance aspect of it. There's a lot of people using the equipment, but doing it like you would use something else. They're not using the equipment as it was designed to work.
I suddenly just thought of another question that I wanted to ask you. This may offend you, and I'll say it in the video too, but there are lots of things that I love about the spade bit, the idea, the balance, the amount of signal that it has. The one thing that I am torn on is the cricket. And the biggest part of that is because some of them are so dang loud, it just irritates me. No, not all of them are. I remember vividly the first time I was ever physically around a spade bit. I was probably in my early 20s, and there was a guy that had just gotten one, and we were gathering that morning, and he was 500 feet off to my right, and I heard that damn cricket all morning long, even though he was that far away. And I was just like, oh man, if I were on that horse, I'd want to go cut that thing out of there. And I've been around some other ones that were older and kind of broke in, and they weren't nearly as loud, but this thing was loud. So what are your thoughts on the necessity of a cricket? And do you ever get annoyed by a brand new one too? Or are there things they can do to tweak it where it's not hearable from half a mile away or what?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely, for us in this system, we kind of enjoy the sound of the cricket, but it just depends, I don't like them. It depends on how the horse is rolling, I guess, when they're frantic.
Yeah, I think
a lot of times I think it
was not a pleasant.
Yeah. No, when they do that rapid thing, it's irritating, and sometimes it is noisy. You'll sit there, especially if you've got 15 or 20 people around in bridles. I mean, it's kind of a roar at times. The way I look at that, I want that horse's jaw to stay relaxed and soft. So if they move that thing, I find that when my horses work, they're not usually doing it. It's something to do when they're not moving their feet.
Yes.
And so I think if they'll do that, and I don't have to keep holding them or telling them not to move, it's one of those things. I think a lot of times it's just like us, whether we smoke or chew or chew toothpicks or chew gum or something, they just need something to kind of pacify themselves a little bit. Yes. But most importantly, it's about keeping that jaw from being just rigid and tight. I want a horse to just, if it'll stay relaxed in its jaw, then its poll and its neck will stay a lot looser. And we're always working on, it's always a balance. For me, I think it's just an important aspect of it. You can always stick a matchstick in there and lock it down.
I had never thought about that.
You take a piece of toothpick and jam it in there. I've done that when I'm hunting sometimes. Because it's like jingle bobs. If you're out hunting deer or hunting elk or something, and you go out there and somebody's wearing a loud pair of jingle bobs, that's not very handy. Yeah, they can be, but mostly it's about them staying. It's always that contradicting thing, that balance, right? Of the horse staying supple yet engaged. And so anything that'll help them stay supple as I create engagement, which is power, which is tension, right? Mm-hmm. You can't flex a muscle without tensing it. And so if I,
goes the other way. Point. Yeah. I do like it from the aspect of training the rider, because I do think there are 99% of people are totally unaware whether their horse has swallowed or moved his tongue or any. I mean, he could have been completely lockjawed for the last 30 minutes and they have no idea. So if you have a cricket in there, you have an auditory signal that, he just did this. So I like that aspect of it. But I don't. Maybe,
and that can be a good indicator of irritation when the horse is pressured, or when it's feeling like it's got a lot of pressure. They'll usually run it a lot more, and so it's kind of like a little warning, and you go, okay, I got to figure out a way to relax this horse before he goes to that next step, right? Before this escalates. So can I take some of this tension away in myself or what we're doing or whatever? It has its uses, but it can be annoying.
Well, I don't like once a bit's been ridden 5 years or something, I guess the copper edges wear off. To me, they're not as bad, but a brand new one, I almost want to go buy a spade bit and then hand it to a friend and say, here, bring this back to me in 5 years and then I'll ride it. So anyway. All right. Well, Mr. Sandifer, it has been a pleasure talking to you. It really has. I don't know if anybody's going to find this interesting but you and I, but hopefully a bunch of people will listen to it and have a little better view into the world of the vaquero. I personally really appreciate that you're not as rigid about it as some are. I have found some people a little difficult to discuss because, I mean, they're, if it ain't the way Grandpa did it, it's wrong. And I don't think that leads to good things. I think you have to be a little thoughtful and flexible here and there and so forth. And I really do appreciate that about you. I know I'm a big experimenter. If somebody could give me just about any kind of bit in the world and I'm going to go throw it on 15 horses and see what in the hell it does. And I don't think if you're not willing to do that kind of stuff, you're going to be very limited in your what you're going to wind up with in the end of this. So
yeah.
I really appreciate that about you. So it's been a pleasure.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
We'll see you next week for another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I've been your host, Daniel Dolphin.